Welcome to this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic, which is going to be a very different presentation in that we won't be the ones presenting most of it. Instead, we're going to share with you an event that we were invited to as VIP space influencers on February 28th of 2025, along with only 24 other channels and media outlets. Very elite audience. And the group hosting this virtual panel was the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration. The panel included aerospace industry experts, contractor representatives, and a 5-time astronaut. So definitely an honor to be handpicked to attend. What we'll do, rather than watch the same grid of faces for the entire episode, is as they're going through their prepared remarks before the Q&A, we'll add in some graphics to help demonstrate points that the panelists were making to go with the frames they brought along themselves that we'll mark with their logo in the lower corner. Along the way, as we do, we'll edit down some of the gaps and stammers associated with a live broadcast to make it a little easier to listen to. There's a lot of great information in here being dispensed by experts in their respective fields, and a lot of that information being provided validated past predictions and concerns of this channel regarding Artemis. Without further interruption, let's get right into it.
Welcome to the first edition of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration's Reporter Education Series. I'm Alan Cutler, President and CEO of the Coalition for Deep Space Exploration, and I'll be serving as your host today. We represent companies across the space industry, from small businesses and suppliers to prime contractors, that are all enabling the next steps of humanity's exploration of the moon and beyond. This series seeks to bring together leading voices in the field, industry representatives, and policy experts to discuss the topics in space today. Many of you are veterans of covering the space industry. However, we wanted to make this series accessible to a wide range of space backgrounds. Today's session aims to provide you with information that supplies the knowledge, context, and expert perspectives needed to report on the evolving landscape of space exploration with confidence and clarity. We're excited to have you join us today and hope this better informs and elevates the conversation around space exploration. Our first speaker today is Jim Mazur. He's a retired aerospace executive with more than 50 years of experience. Before retiring, he most recently served as the president of Space Propulsion and Power Systems for L3Harris's Aerojet Rocketdyne business, overseeing design, development, testing, manufacturing of launch vehicle and spacecraft power and propulsion systems. Jim has held key leadership roles at Aerojet Rocketdyne, Pratt & Whitney, SpaceX, Sea Launch, and McDonnell Douglas, now Boeing. He graduated magna cum laude from the University of Akron with a Bachelor and Master's of Science in Engineering, earned an MBA from UCLA. He has also served as the president of AIAA and on the boards of the Space Foundation and the California Chamber of Commerce. With his extensive experience in leadership in aerospace, Jim is a valuable addition to today's dialogue, providing insight into architecture design. Jim, the floor is yours.
All right. Thanks, Alan. Hi, everybody. I think in order to orient everybody to what we're talking about, I wanted to highlight the magnitude of distances involved between low Earth orbit, the moon, and Mars, and how this relates to NASA, private industry, and commercial. Low Earth orbit is about 250 miles above the Earth, which is where International Space Station is, where a lot of activity has been going on for many decades. The moon is about 240,000 miles away. That's days away. And then Mars is on the order of 140 million miles, which is many, many months away. These are huge distances, and the further away you get from Earth, the longer and more complex the journey is. The total time of the journey, life support, how your body reacts in the low gravity, even radiation, landing and liftoff complexity, communications complexity, and then, of course, return to the Earth and re-entry velocity. The difference between a moon re-entry velocity and a low Earth orbit re-entry velocity is huge in terms of the complexity and the heat required. And all of that translates to risk and can drive architecture. So the model has been to learn to live off the Earth, near Earth, with International Space Station. That space station was a multinational station. Many different nations' governments helped build it. And over time in this model was to hand over low Earth orbit to private industry so that NASA can then focus its energies on the next hard thing, which is moon, and then moon onto Mars. I want to note, too, that commercial human spaceflight to low Earth orbit has had NASA as an anchor customer and also NASA providing the anchor destination. And so low Earth orbit, which is basically, other than suborbital, one of the easiest things to get to, still does not have a robust, what I would call commercial private industry economy. And the goal is to retire station and start having commercial stations up there. But after many decades, that doesn't exist. So my opinion is it would be incredibly naive to think that we can immediately extend the commercial model to the moon and lunar occupation. We really need NASA in partnership with private industry to build the infrastructure to be able to go and this time stay on the moon. There's the journey there, as I said, the landing, staying, the exploration, the infrastructure, and liftoff and return. And so the idea is we've started to learn how to live off the Earth, close to the Earth. The next destination is the moon, which is much further away, but close enough that you can still manage risk. And once we learn how to do that, we can learn to live on Mars. And so for the moon, we have the necessary and what I would call complementary elements in play. And there are actually very many of them in play, maybe too many. I could argue it all at one time. But some of the key ones are crew to and from lunar orbit, which is SLS and Orion. Human landing system is to the surface of the moon from lunar orbit and then back to lunar orbit. Spacesuits and comms, to name a few. So all of these elements, I would say, as reporters in this industry, you would want to be paying attention to and seeing how the progress is going for all of them, because they're all really necessary. And with crewed flights, the approach is generally first fly an uncrewed flight and then fly a crewed flight to burn down risk. SLS has accomplished the first step, and we'll do the second, what I understand is April of next year. HLS, human landing system, from lunar orbit to the moon and back to lunar orbit, really has a very long way to go. There are still many launches, cryo transfers, landing and liftoff, and there's a lot of progress yet to be made on that. And I understand 2025 is going to be a significant year for milestones that you should pay attention to. So at this point in time, I think there are some who are saying, we should just cancel SLS and go all Starship or all commercial. And I think that's a really bad idea right now. It's actually the only proven element of the architecture right now, and it's also the most capable. The currency of interest in going to the moon is the amount of weight you can take the translunar injection. And this chart shows the up through SLS Block 1, the vehicles that have flown and actually put something into orbit. And they're all in the expendable version because as you start going further and further away from the Earth, you need as much energy as you can to maximize mass so you can take the translunar injection. And you can see SLS Block 1, and then they're working on Block 2, has a significant amount of mass to translunar injection. What that translates is to the amount of stuff you can take to the moon with you on Orion or potentially as an adjacent cargo module. And that translates ultimately to time away from the Earth that you can spend. So in this case, size really does matter. And so I think it's a bad idea to get rid of proven capability when you do not have a proven replacement. And we have plenty of examples in our history in the space program of doing exactly that. The last Apollo mission was in 1972, at least to the moon. There was an Apollo-Soyuz in 75, but the first shuttle mission was in 1981. So we had a gap in human space flight, you could argue 6 to 9 years. The last shuttle flight, STS-135, was in 2011. The first commercial crew was announced in November 2012 and planned a 2016 launch, and the actual was November of 2020. Which was a 9-year gap. And during that 9-year gap of U.S. human spaceflight, we had to buy rides from the Russians. And crew to low Earth orbit is one of the easiest things you can do. It required no technology development. ISS was already there, etc. So I believe that Starship will be available someday, but it's going to take time and money. And the question is maybe not so much how much money, but really how much time. And so it's critically important with the time and money that we understand how long the tech development's going to take. To go to the moon and land with the concepts currently in play with Starship and Blue Origin's lander, they both required significant technology development that wasn't required to go to low Earth orbit. There's a large number of launches, there's cryo transfer, cryo fluid management, which we haven't had to do on the moon before because we used storables before. So I think right now we have an undefined gap on how long it's going to take for that technology development. And in our history in aerospace and space, if you put technology development on critical path, that means you have an undefined timeline and an undefined gap. And given the fact, I personally believe we're to some degree in a race with China to go to the moon, and to some degree that we need a fallback capability because technology is not guaranteed. This is very complex technologies that have not been tried before. It would be good to have SLS as a fallback plan for potential other landing opportunities with different architectural concepts. So our history of cancellations and gapping really hasn't served the nation well for human spaceflight or for the moon and Mars. When you really think about it, back in the days in the 60s, I mean, I used to watch all these shows, where we had Colony on the Moon in 1999, 2001 Space Odyssey, but everything thought things were advanced much faster. And the reason they haven't is we haven't had consistency and constancy of purpose on a path forward. Prematurely extending the commercial model to the moon, I believe, will slow us down. What we need to do is focus on private industry and LEO. NASA partnered with private industry and complementary capabilities going to the moon and using our activities on the moon to learn how to go to Mars. It's not either NASA or private and commercial, it is and. The other comment I would make is NASA does have interests beyond just commercial interests. They have stated what's the reason for exploration. Certainly science and exploration, national posture, the agreements with other countries to basically colonize the moon, and the inspiration. And so I think those are all very important. Since this is intended to help provide perspective and encourage you to get perspectives from many different people and many different backgrounds, there is some homework that I have been doing for a long time, but would encourage you to do if you haven't. NASA has a Moon to Mars architecture, and it's pretty deep document, but there is a strategy and objective section, executive summary. I would encourage you to look at that. I would also encourage you to look at the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel 2024 report, which came out in January, in particular Section 4, which highlights the Artemis activities. And also I'd encourage you to look at Figure 1.7, which if human landing system gets delayed, there are other ways to burn down risk that were used in the past that I think could still be used in the future with SLS capability. And I would leave you with just follow the programs, all the items I listed, and see how they're progressing according to plan and schedule, and ask a lot of questions. Thank you.
All right, Jim. Well, thanks a lot. There's a lot to chew on there, and greatly appreciate it. Next up, we've got Marcia Evans, a former NASA astronaut and a veteran of 5 space shuttle flights, accumulating over 1,300 hours in space. Marcia has also logged over 7,000 hours in both civilian and NASA aircraft. During her time at NASA, she contributed significantly to the Space Shuttle, Space Station, and Constellation programs. She earned a Bachelor of Science degree in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Colorado. Marcia's extensive experience includes working as an engineer on orbiter displays and controls, manned-machine engineering, and the development of the orbiter heads-up display. She also served as a flight engineer for the shuttle training aircraft. With her expertise and firsthand experience in human spaceflight, I think of no one better to provide us with an astronaut's perspective on human spaceflight and what should be considered when planning missions and questions to think about. Marcia.
Thank you. And I'd like to think of it more as a human's perspective on human spaceflight. And the stuff that Jim described is really hard. Going to space, particularly sending humans to space, is hard and it's unsafe. And so to achieve an acceptable level of safety in doing this, you have to consider what your risk is. And there are a number of kinds of risks. There's a program risk, there's a mission risk, and then there's a risk to human life. And so basically, the question I would ask is, how is anybody who is building hardware for space, how are they addressing risk? What tools are they using? And what people are they using to execute those tools? How much risk are they willing to take in providing a product to whatever customer, NASA or commercial, that they are offering it to? How do they determine it? How do they plan to eliminate it when they have identified a risk? If they can't, how do they plan to reduce the risk? And if it can't be reduced, how do they manage to control the risk? What are all of those steps? In the crew office, before we got on a spacecraft, we tried to understand to the best of our ability what that risk story really was. If you can reduce your risk, you can enhance your reliability. The reverse doesn't actually work. The reliability is your ability to successfully perform that thing that you are doing, to execute that successfully. And the higher the reliability, the safer you feel. If you look at the statistics of reliability, the more often you have to repeat a task in order to achieve a single mission, if I need 20 engines instead of 3 engines, all to be running at the same time in order to achieve orbit, if I have to refuel something 10 times before I can send it a single time to the moon, then you have to look at what is the reliability at the end of all of those things. And it gets complicated. You multiply your reliability times itself a number of times and what you get it. So if I have a 1 in 50 chance of failure in trying to do a single task, and I have to do it 10 times in order to execute the mission, I got an 18% chance that I'm going to be unsuccessful at some point. So that's something to consider. And then the question is, who is doing this determination of reliability? When you look at reliability, you're looking at a likelihood of it happening and the consequence if it does happen. Well, what tools are they using to do that? Is it engineering judgment? Who are the engineers? Who are the people that did that? If you think about our history in human spaceflight, back in the Apollo days, the industrial base, the people that were doing that work came from the military. They came from building ballistic missiles and hardware to operate in that environment. And then they built Apollo. The people that built Apollo, that industrial base, that supply chain that was providing all of those components, they did Apollo, they moved into shuttle, and then from shuttle, space station. But like Jim says, we haven't built anything really in 30 years. So what industrial base are we using to do that? What is the supply chain that we're using to do that? We have learned the hard way and numerous times that a commercial product that you buy for everyday Earth use doesn't necessarily execute the same way when you put it into the environment of space. So I would ask that. And then I would ask your safety organization, who do they work for? Are they truly independent? Do they have the kind of teeth that is required in order to hold a program's feet to the fire in making sure that you have done your safety and reliability work correctly, or do they work for the program? I think that's a very important question to ask. I would ask, what is the technology readiness level, the TRL of a system? If you look at hardware being built today in many of the commercial providers, their TRL level is 3 or 4, and that is breadboard design being tested. It is not something that has been tested as a assembly or as a full-up test before you're ready to actually stick people in the middle of that. I think that's an important question to ask. And so that's basically what I would have to offer.
Lots of questions to think about. Going to switch gears a little bit here. We've got our next speaker, Tom Culligan. He was a longtime House Appropriations Committee associate staff to the subcommittee chairman that funded NASA during the time where the creation of many of the elements of what is now Artemis and the commercial crew and cargo programs. He now works as an aerospace consultant on policy and strategic communications and co-hosts a podcast, Just Another Space Podcast, about politics, policy, funding, and markets of the space industry that can be found on all of your favorite podcasting platforms. Today, Tom is here in his personal capacity as a longtime friend of the coalition and as someone who is passionate about the Artemis missions through his roles in government and industry. He will discuss the budget for returning to the moon and how it stacks up to the past.
Good afternoon, and I apologize in advance for my voice. I'm just getting over the flu, so I sound like RFK Jr. right now. So, as Alan mentioned, longtime friend of CDSE, and the program here was really honored to be part of NASA spaceflight spending decisions on Capitol Hill during my many years up there. I wanted to spend some time today talking about some of the myths around the cost of the Artemis program relative to other human spaceflight programs, including Apollo. Because so often, as you all hear and we hear, programs are expensive, unsustainable, and more costly than ever. And I think hopefully this data helps provide additional context. A big part of what I did here today was I went back and I did a full inflation adjustment of Apollo and, as you'll see a little bit later on, more modern human spaceflight programs. So in this case, we've got an inflation-adjusted spending curve and chart, with the blue line being Apollo and the orange line being Artemis. Starting in year one is essentially when the Apollo program was approved and spending began. And then year one here is actually when the Orion program began back in 2006 or 2007. If I look at that chart in context, we see that the average annual Apollo spending was 4.5 times Artemis spending by year. Most importantly, my biggest takeaway there is, look, if you saw the bell curve there on the Apollo program, it follows a natural development program curve. If I look at the Artemis program, and we'll talk about this in a minute, why it was so constrained, you can see it never actually benefited from a natural development curve like we've seen in other human spaceflight programs. Total Apollo costs adjusted for inflation, $239 billion in 2024 dollars. Artemis costs today at about $73 billion, going back to 2006. I look at it in context. So far, we've only spent about a third on Artemis that we did on our Apollo for actually a much more robust capability with some sustainable elements included in there, which include multiple landers, a permanent lunar gateway in lunar orbit, and obviously a much broader range of lunar surface systems. The other thing that it funds in Artemis that we didn't fund back then, some really important technology developments necessary to demonstrate that we're ready and capable of doing missions to Mars and other deep space destinations, including the solar electric propulsion on Gateway and space cryotransfer that we'll watch and see if SpaceX is able to do with the Starship this year and Blue in the next year or two, and then obviously fission surface power. And we're seeing a lot of interest in lunar surface power, whether for solar or for nuclear. Now getting into a little bit more granular spending details, what we're seeing is the price per seat to the moon under Artemis is a much better deal than Apollo, not surprisingly. We send 4 astronauts on Orion, which our speaker on Orion we'll talk about later, versus 3 in Apollo. So 25% more astronaut seat at 1/4 of the seat cost compared to the Apollo program. And then finally, I think maybe in the big picture, one of the biggest differences is back during Apollo, that program consumed nearly all of NASA's annual budget. And notably, its budget was much bigger than NASA's inflation-adjusted budget today. Today, the Artemis program only consumes about 20% of NASA's annual budget. So 1/5 of the net spending for the agency compared to nearly all of it back then, which of course leaves room for robust ISS and commercial LEO funding for science, for space technology, and for aeronautics. So putting this in the context of the overall budget, as we talk about budget reconciliation and some of these larger budget fights, we spend about $8 billion per year in present day dollars on Artemis elements. And that includes everything from SLS Orion, ground systems to HLS, the other commercial type elements like Gateway and spacesuits and lunar terrain vehicles. So to put in the context, that's 0.125% of total annual U.S. federal spending, or 1/8 of 1%. It amounts to about $80 per U.S. household, not per person, U.S. household of 4. And again, it's less than 1% of annual defense spending and only about 1/3 of 1% of annual U.S. mandatory spending, which has been in the news quite a bit. We spend more on federal interest payments on our debt to foreign debt holders than we do on Apollo after about 3 days and 8 hours of spending. So the leadership role that having a robust NASA exploration program in Artemis provides us, we are spending far more money paying debt payments to foreign countries, including some of the countries we are trying to demonstrate we are in a leadership role relative to them. Final just analogy, because I put this together around the Super Bowl. The U.S. budget were a football field at 100 yards. The Artemis program spending would account to the equivalent of 4 inches on that field. Just a couple breakouts here. Here you can see the Apollo crew and service module versus the Orion system here. Very similar bell curve for Apollo CSM versus what we've seen on Orion. And then I look at Apollo Saturn family, not just Saturn V, also includes the Saturn 1B spending and development versus what we've seen spent on SLS. So we were spending about 3.4 times on average for Apollo development and operations than we have on SLS to date. Now, kind of getting to what does this all pay for? It's not just the hardware. In reality, as you all know from your organizations, your biggest expense on everything is personnel, and personnel is what makes this stuff come together. So I took a sample of some of the key states, particularly in light of this administration, key states for the president that he won and certainly cares about. And you can see just how much NASA and its contractor work and its centers in a lot of these states make up the entire aerospace and defense workforce and the economic impact associated with that. So in certain centers like Marshall Space Flight Center, it's really 60% of the state's aerospace and defense workforce is being paid for by NASA programs there and the Moon and Mars associated elements. And then you can see that kind of ranges between 14, 15% in Ohio and up to high teens and 20s in Texas and Florida. It is very significant. It has significant tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supplier and contractor impacts and significant economic output. Really, you can see that these Artemis programs, and I'd throw the ISS in there too in the case of JSC and Marshall, are largely sustaining the NASA center workforce and infrastructure through the annual federal appropriations for these programs. So kind of just to put it all in context, modern era of human spaceflight went back to 92, inflation adjusted everything. So orange bars are the NASA total budget appropriation each year, and the blue bar represents of that spending, how much was spent on human spaceflight. And you can see it's actually been fairly steady. You see a drop during the sequestration years. Like if I go to 2013, 2014, 2015, we kind of have recovered from that. But largely it's been steady, and about 50% of NASA's annual spending for both low Earth orbit, whether that's shuttle and ISS, or more recently commercial crew and cargo and CLD and ISS, and then obviously the exploration programs have made up about 50% of NASA spending. What does that look like specifically? So within the major human spaceflight programs, here's a little bit of a sand chart that shows that spending change over time. So the dark blue is the space shuttle for the years that it was flying. The orange above it is the International Space Station. So obviously the bigger chunk there on the front half is really the ISS development and assembly in orbit. And then more recently, particularly after 2012, you kind of see stable ISS operations. Then that light blue you see come in as commercial cargo and then crew. The medium blue is the Orion program. Yellow is SLS. Green is exploration ground systems that pays for the SLS processing. And then you can see the really dark blue is Gateway. The brown is HLS. And that black is XEVAS and human surface mobility. All that to say, it's kind of interesting. Whereas I go back 30 years ago, we were paying for two programs, one transportation for crew and cargo, one platform destination and low Earth orbit. Today, for less net money, for about $2 billion less than I was paying 30 years ago, I have a ISS that's fully operational. I've got 3 cargo vehicles, either in operation or coming online. I've got 2 commercial low Earth orbit vehicles. I've got a deep space exploration rocket and spacecraft and ground support systems. I've got 2 landers. I've got a gateway, so a lunar space station being developed and getting ready to be deployed, and then a whole range of lunar surface things. So from a value standpoint, we have basically significantly expanded our ability to do more in both low Earth orbit and in deep space than we have ever before, certainly when compared to Apollo, but especially even compared to 30 years ago. And I think a lot of people might say, well, that's because we're doing things commercially in some ways. And there's some element of that we can chat about. But a lot of it is also looking at we're doing deep space, whether it's the traditional SLS, Orion, EGS, and ISS parts, or we're with our newer commercial entrants, we're doing it differently and a lot more affordably. Now, one of the most notable things here is if I look at the traditional programs like shuttle, station, and then more recently SLS, Orion, and EGS, those carry a lot of center and NASA workforce and the institutional and infrastructure costs within those budget lines. So they largely pay for those NASA centers and for headquarters associated costs. But these newer commercial programs, starting with cargo and crew and HLS and gateway and XEVAS, really don't contribute much, if any, funding for those center and institutional costs. They pay a marginal tax for their specific program management, but it really doesn't come packaged with all the other institutional costs. So if I take those programs out of this sand chart to show what NASA's lost in terms of programs that are paying for their institutional capacities, I see a net reduction in $4 billion a year of things that used to help contribute towards the sustainment and investment in those centers and infrastructure that now are being borne by only a much more limited part of the budget and about half of what was being borne by these programs 30 years ago. I think if I leave you with nothing else today, and this is one of my biggest pet peeves as an appropriator, is when we talk about canceling programs, we talk about architecture changes, what we really need to talk about is, let's say I'm going to cancel SLS. I'm going to save $2.6 billion a year. Well, I'm actually not if I'm going to keep Marshall and Michoud and Stennis and KSC funded the way they are now, and with the workforces they have now, and with the NASA institutional support that they have now. Because if I'm going to continue to pay for that out of some other account, I'm actually not capturing meaningful savings through programmatic terminations. ISS today is 1/25th of NASA's budget, just about $1 billion for operational costs, including all of the work that it supports at Johnson Space Center and at Marshall for payload processing and operations. And so I think we've lost some of that consideration of what's included in these budget lines. We can have a debate about the value of that and how we should pay for that and what the merit of having those NASA centers and that NASA expertise in-house is. But I think that's largely been lost in the reporting to date as we have these conversations, and certainly on Capitol Hill. So I think the appropriators look at it and go, am I paying more for less? No, I'm paying less for more. Am I spending more on institutional capacity through all these programs? No, I've got fewer programs paying for institutional capacity. What's the value of that institutional capacity? I think that's the debate we probably going to have in Congress, depending on what the administration proposes and where things go. But with that, Alan, I will try and recover my voice and happy to take any questions at the end.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Tom. And being a Friday and talking about budgets, there should have been a big warning sign at the front end of this saying, warning, budget discussion coming. No, it's all right. No, thanks a lot, Tom. Appreciate it. Our final speaker today is Paul Anderson. He is Lockheed Martin's Deputy Program Manager for Orion. With 39 years at Lockheed Martin, he's worked on countless high-profile NASA projects, including Orion, HLS, GOES-R, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, Hubble robotic servicing missions, and countless others. Paul is going to talk about spacecraft development, particularly how it's being applied to NASA's Orion deep space exploration vehicle. Floor yours.
You bet. Yeah, and thank you, Alan, and everybody for having me today. It's really a privilege, and it's awesome getting to represent the Orion program as the Deputy Program Manager for Lockheed Martin. Again, it's a very awesome team that I get to represent. We actually have 3,000 suppliers that are supporting it. So, this isn't just NASA, Lockheed Martin. This is really the nation's industrial base that's talking to you today. So it's really an honor to be here. I thought I would actually start off before I bring up my one chart that I'd like to show. And, behind me, I guess we can use our team's background these days. And I wanted to show you, the latest, it's a little bit, about a month old, a photo of the Artemis 1 spacecraft. And I think most folks are familiar. Artemis 1 flew very successfully about 2 years ago, 1.4 million miles to the moon and back, successfully launched, successfully executed the mission, and then, of course, successfully re-entered and landed in December of 2022 on a 25-day uncrewed mission. That was not the end of it, though, however, for Artemis 1. We were able to take advantage of that and repurpose the vehicle. After the flight, a 1-year test campaign down at the Armstrong Test Facility in Ohio, where we did all, I'll say, abort testing, high-level acoustics, that sort of thing, and just beat the snot out of it. And it just was a fantastic learning experience where we learned how robust this vehicle is. And, I really appreciated Jim talking up front about, the challenges of, the distances between going to ISS, to the moon, to Mars, et cetera. And, what's unique about Orion, and again, it's been many years in development, but we have got a spacecraft that is capable of going to the moon safely with crew, and then actually capable of going to Mars and in future missions. So we have designed this vehicle for crew safety. We have designed it for long-term exploration missions and built a really robust vehicle. So super proud to be part of this mission. Actually, I've got some hardware photos all the way up to Artemis 6 here. There are evolutions. The learning that is required for human spaceflight is build a little, test a little. Well, I like to say build more, test more. Each one of these vehicles is adding more capability. We're flying missions and learning more, applying to those future missions, and even doing things like successively increasing the amount of hardware reuse as we go forward into future missions. As we prove the capabilities, we are driving in more and more reuse into these flights. And specifically, as we go from Artemis 2 to Artemis 5, there is a significant amount of reuse going between those vehicles. And then eventually from 3 to 6, and then we go 4 to 7 and so on, we're going to be reusing, essentially the crew modules in the majority of the spacecraft. So not only are we learning how to fly, how crew can survive in these missions, how they can operate, we're also learning how we can reuse hardware to drive the cost of these programs down. Anyway, just kind of starting with the first chart, Artemis 2 there on the left-hand side, that's actually a 3-day-old picture. For some of us working this program, we are 24/7 and have been for a period of time. Are going to continue to be so all the way through the Artemis 3 delivery, which I'll talk here in a bit. That photo is taken 3 days ago at the Kennedy Space Center in the Armstrong Operations and Control Building. The spacecraft, the Artemis 2 vehicle, had just been lifted, getting prepared for solar array wing installation, which actually has started. So we have our Airbus partners in Florida right now installing the solar array wings for the Artemis 2 mission. We've got about 2 more months of effort once that is complete to complete the Artemis 2 spacecraft. We're planning to hand that over no later than the end of April to NASA. At that point in time, the spacecraft will be fueled. It will be installed the launch abort system. It will be handed over to the Space Launch System integrated, flying our Artemis 2 mission out of Kennedy Space Center no later than the end of April of next year. So we're extremely excited, and you can see how the Artemis 2 vehicle is essentially ready to go. We're very proud that we have gotten this far in its development, and they're super excited about the mission that's coming up. Artemis 3, which is there in the middle, it's kind of hid behind the scaffolding. That photo was actually taken in May. That's where we first assembled the European service module to the Artemis 3 crew module. It is just over a year behind where Artemis 2 is. So you can see how the production is flowing down in Florida out of the ONC. This is extremely exciting. The evolution from 2 to 3 is yet another step. We are flying crewed around the moon on 2. Artemis 3 is crewed to dock with the human landing system and go to the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. And that mission is just over a year behind Artemis 2 at this point. So we're extremely excited for Artemis 3. All of the processing, again, that you're seeing here, most of it is at the ONC building down at Kennedy Space Center. And I'm also showing some photos here of some of the European service modules that are being produced by Airbus in Bremen, Germany. There's actually a photo there of Artemis 5 and 6. Those production activities are being done as we speak, as is the Artemis 4 crew module that's at the ONC and the Artemis 5 pressure vessel that we right now have in friction stir welding down at our math facility in New Orleans. So lots of hardware going through right now, getting ready for not just Artemis 2, but all of these future missions as we're going forward, exploring the moon and beyond into the future. I talked a little bit about reuse. Super proud of that activity. The lesson here, learning how to do things in the condition of the hardware after it came back from the Artemis 1, image that's over my head right now. We learned, again, how robust and how, I'll just say, in good condition that a lot of the hardware was. It's really going to enable us to do the reuse as we go from 2 to 5 and 3 to 6 and continue to increase that in the future. And as we fly, we'll learn more about that. Trying to drive production rates up, costs down is just imperative, as well as always maintaining crew safety front and center. This is just an Orion-centric chart. This doesn't necessarily cover all of the elements of Artemis. Just for the Orion program, I've heard folks say, all dollars spent on space are actually on Earth. Actually, 50% of our dollars on the Orion program go to small businesses. And again, we have 3,600 suppliers. It's all 50 states. Tom had talked a little bit about this before, but it is a benefit. And I like to show this chart, not just from an economic perspective, but also to say, hey, this is a national team of everybody. It obviously involves NASA, large contractors like Lockheed Martin, but also literally thousands of small businesses across the country. I turn it back to you, Alan, and I guess it's question time.
Very useful. It's great to sit there and kind of walk through. When we talk through the money and we talk through the things to think about, and then to see the Orion capsule and see those thoughts, processes, and everything kind of playing out in the vehicles that we have today. I know that was a lot of information provided, and I'm sure it's generated a question or two. This is an audience of inquiring minds after all. For the question and answer portion of today's program, we ask that you put your questions in the chat. While you're getting your fingers all warmed up and firing away on your questions, I will start the ball rolling. Here in Washington, there's been a little bit of turmoil and a lot of churn happening. We had a hearing with the House Science Committee this week where there was various opinions about the Artemis program were expressed. I think my opening question would be to the panel, how important is program stability, both in process from a program's perspective and funding to ensure the success of a mission?
It's been great to see how consistent Congress has been, which, as America's least popular institution by polling most years, you hear a lot of jokes about politicians, but honestly, they've been really the pillar of stability throughout various administrations. And I think, we've seen Chairman Cruz on the Senate side, Chairman Babin on the House side, kind of all say, hey, yep, again, there's a reason we in our last authorization bill named the program Moon to Mars. That was actually Congress's idea. That wasn't from the Trump or Biden administrations. And so the goal has always been to go to Mars, going back to, I think it was at least the 2010 authorization, if not before then. I just say, again, you continue to see on the congressional side tremendous alignment around the programs of record and the objectives.
I'll say the funding certainty question, the angle of that. And, I would echo what you said again. Space is hard in a lot of ways, but, the funding and the congressional support has really been outstanding. Nothing is ever perfect. We've had very outstanding bipartisan support. We continue to have that. That is an obvious, a key enabler for us to do the sort of things that I just showed. I just showed a, cadre of vehicles. It actually goes back to our exploration flight test that we did in 2014 to Artemis 1 behind me, to the photos, all of that hardware. It doesn't happen in, one vote, 1 year, one administration even. And so to be able to really do a long-term exploration program, maintain the strategy, maintain the constituency is extremely important, and really appreciate the support that the program has had over the years.
I would just jump in, and that was kind of what my message was about with consistency and constancy of purpose. What Tom showed of Apollo, versus what NASA's doing today with Artemis. Apollo is a more traditional development program. In the private world, what we would do is to get things done, you want to get up to speed, ramp up fast, and burn down all your risk early on. And then as you bring things towards production and operational capability, you ramp down. And most programs that have had trouble are the ones where they get in and they're looking at how much money they have to spend, how fast. And the muckety mucks up top don't like that because they got to hit their profit goals or whatever. And they scale back the funding. What that does is drag out the program. And so what NASA is on is they don't have the luxury of having that development capability bubble that they had in the past during Apollo. So they're executing the programs under an annual budget. And what I'm surprised to see, even with the numbers that Tom's showing, is they're doing a great job of that with an annual budget funding. And the worst thing you can do is upset that and change direction. The consistency and constancy of purpose of the model, learn to live in low Earth orbit, learn to live on the moon, take those learnings and go to Mars is the way to go. And all you do is manage the program to the funding you have, but constantly make progress in that direction. So disrupting that, I think, is the worst thing this country could do, especially in the international environment we're operating in.
One thing that we saw in the Constellation program is that you can ensure a certain level of funding, but if it is not enough to execute the program, meaning to provide for your testing and your continued development, then the schedule continues to slip. So you have the design that you want to fly, you have the schedule that you want to meet, you have the money that's being allocated to that. You can pin one of those things. But when you change one, the others will change. And so I think we need to keep that in mind for all programs.
Excellent. All right. Well, it's not a shy audience. We've got questions. First one from CSS. Jim mentioned that it's going to take time and money to get Starship going, but SpaceX has gone through most of its fixed firm funding. What happens when SpaceX runs out of funding?
Yeah. So the assumption I'm making is, up till this point in time, SpaceX has not had trouble raising money. And so the assumption I'm making is they will continue to raise money and that they won't run out of money. So with that assumption that they have unlimited funding resources, to me, the real variable is time. And the message I'm trying to drive home is, given the level of technology development, it's guaranteed it's going to take more time than what they signed up for. And what's really uncertain is just how much more time will it take, because this level of technology development to get to the moon is unlike anything we've seen on critical path. So it's definitely going to take longer. And then the real question is, can this technology be made ready with any reasonable amount of time frame? Because you're talking about landing cryos on the moon, and you got to keep those cold. Not only do you have multiple launches, not only do you have multiple joining of big spacecraft, transfer of fuels, you got to take these cryos all the way out to the moon, keep them cold while you're on the moon, cold enough to lift off of the moon. And that requires, believe it or not, power, and a lot of power. So with time and money, this can close, but do we have that luxury? And the variable I'm looking at is time. And we have the luxury of that, and we better have a fallback plan, because we're spending, whether it's private money or public money, a lot of money is being spent on technology development to get to the moon, which means we're starving technology development to stay on the moon.
One of the assumptions in the question, which is a really good one, is have they depleted their fixed price payments? Because, given where they are in their development schedule, one of the things that's different about the HLS contracts is, unlike commercial crew and cargo, where all the development milestones and the taxpayer-funded payments associated with those milestones, those are made public at the start of the program. We have not seen that on HLS or some of the more recent programs. So, I think a question for the media I'd put out there is, have they actually, what were their original milestones? What were the payments that they proposed associated with those milestones? And have they actually drawn down those payments because they have or haven't met those milestones yet?
We've got Alex from Nature magazine. Got a question for Marcia. Could you talk about the additional challenges for human exploration going from moon to Mars? What are the biggest unsolved issues in sending astronauts all the way to Mars, and what research needs to be done to answer those questions?
That's a great question. Thank you for that. I think, if you think about it, during the Apollo days, Neil Armstrong just sort of off the cuff estimated that he had a 50-50 chance of surviving going all the way to the moon and back. I think when the statisticians got in the middle of it, it was about a 1 in 5 chance, so we beat those odds. If you think about going back to the moon now, some 55 years later, just because we've done it before doesn't mean we can necessarily do it again. So the risk is that we are essentially assuming the equivalent risk that we did during Apollo to go back to the moon again, except we're going to the hardest place you can possibly land on the moon, the South Pole. And we're doing it with hardware that is essentially unchanged from a technology standpoint from the hardware that we used during Apollo, except for this, the cryo parts of the engine. So we've made it a little bit more complicated. From the International Space Station, you can get back to Earth anytime in a 24-hour period if you have an emergency and you need to get home. To get home from the moon during Apollo took you 3 days. To get home from the moon in the current architecture through Gateway is a week. And so there's some technology that needs to be developed in order to enable sustaining a crew in the event of a failure if we need to get back home. Now, when you go to Mars, think about what we've landed on Mars. The largest thing we have landed on the Mars is the size of a smart car. And before we can land humans on the moon, we have to have developed and tested and guaranteed the survivability of an infrastructure that will support the crew on Mars and returning them from Mars. And that says nothing about the getting to and back in that radiation environment with you just can't turn around and come home in 3 days like we did on, Apollo 13. So pick a technology, every one of them needs to be pushed in development in order to sustain support or even guarantee the success of, marginal success, of any mission going to Mars.
Next one was from Miles Dorn at CBS, and I think some of this is born out of some of the reporting that you've seen across some platforms discussing the cancellation of SLS. But Miles' question is, if SLS was canceled, and that's a question yet to be resolved, but could a commercial heavy lift launch vehicle, Glenn, for example, be adapted to get Orion to the moon, and what would that require, and how long might that take? It may not have been studied yet or even thought of.
Personally, I don't think I've looked at that. I think right now, Block 1 of SLS is using a lot of its capability to get a fully complemented Orion into lunar orbit, how I'd characterize it, which means 4 astronauts with full supplies. I'd be surprised if New Glenn, with its current capability, or some other vehicle with much lower translunar injection capability, could get there without the addition of at least another stage. So most of these vehicles are 2-stage. My guess would be these vehicles would require at least a 3rd stage to make up for the lack of what we call Delta V to get to the moon.
Next one, at the House hearing, with Dan Dumbacher hinted that an Apollo-like lander should be used for Artemis and let the other 2 landers come online at their own pace, given their complexity. Is that even possible, given the timelines that NASA has articulated? Could a mini Apollo-style lander be fast-tracked at this late juncture and still get to the moon by 2030? Is it even possible?
Okay, I'll be happy to take that one too. The concept there is this is where I was talking about a fallback plan, as we're in this low TRL environment. We have the technology to land on the moon today with what was used in the Apollo era, which is called storable propellants. And those propellants are much easier to manage. Typically, you actually have to use a little power to keep them warm from freezing. But these are propellants that when you combine them together, they ignite automatically. So they're also extremely reliable and extremely proven. And so what Dumbacher is suggesting is the concept of going to a more traditional storable propellant lander. And you would likely fly that on a second SLS mission. So you'd have an SLS crewed mission and then an SLS lander mission that could, in much more Apollo style, meet in lunar orbit or meet at Gateway, go down to the moon and land. And I do believe that if focus was put on a storable lander, it could be achieved by 2030, but it would require sort of that bubble that you saw in Apollo, not nearly the size, but it would definitely require a lot of funding and focus up front. But all that technology exists today.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that I think if you go back and look at Blue Origin's original proposal for their lander, I think it used storables. Don't quote me on this because I'm not 100% sure, but I think their demo mission to the moon of an uncrewed lander is going to be using storables before they look at switching to a cryo transfer architecture. So I think to your point, Jim, and maybe to Dan's point, is there, it is certainly the fastest, safest, least new technology development roadmap to having a capability. And I think, again, people can go fact check this. I think Blue might be kind of doing that initially for their demo.
Saving best for last, or at least certainly topical for Washington, at least. We've got two questions that are DOGE related, so I'm going to kind of put them together so everyone can kind of have at it. But here we've got from Patrick Boyle and Leonard David. Is the government plan for NASA to compete with private enterprise or work with them? Is Elon Musk DOGE expected to be a big problem for NASA funding? Or does SpaceX benefit from NASA's budget? And given the threat of NASA layoffs, how would that prospect impact our return to the moon?
So is the government plan for NASA to compete with private enterprise or to work with them? I think the plan, as we've seen it, is that they very much are using privately developed capabilities more than I think we've ever seen in a NASA architecture. I mean, really, this is the biggest thing to like a Thanksgiving buffet that I've ever seen, which is everybody bring what you got and let's go figure out how to do this. So I think if anything, it's a very aggressively forward leaning and bringing in privately developed technologies and systems to do these missions, which carries some other types of risks, but it certainly leans on the inclusive side. And then the question about what happens with DOGE for NASA funding, I don't know, right? Because, I think we've seen what's happened in the initial people who took the fork in the road email. We've seen maybe what might be happening with the probationary employees, although I know that several of the senators representing NASA states like Senator Britt and Senator Cruz intervened to try and ask for a delay on that, which was granted. We talk about DOGE a lot. What I'm really looking at is NASA's budget that's coming out probably in late April, May, June timeframe. And you're going to see Russ Vought, who was OMB administrator or director during the first Trump administration. This will be the administration's first budget blueprint. So how much of a cost target do they put on NASA? Is it as much as they're doing on other non-defense agencies? Is it greater than? Is it less than? Do they pursue that through kind of like top line things like acquisition reform or reducing, red tape and paperwork costs, or do they do it through program terminations? I think everybody in DC is just looking at it with a giant question mark right now and waiting to see what needs to happen. But I can tell you, I'm starting to see on Capitol Hill, and again, in members' remarks and reactions, Congress is starting to reassert itself in their reactions, which is saying, look, the president proposes, and at the end of the day, Congress disposes. So we look forward to seeing what the president proposes here. At the end of the day, the president's budget is the document that they're going to react against, not unofficial DOGE activities. And I think we'll see over the next 2 months kind of where Congress goes here.
If you look at NASA's budget, I'm sure all government organizations could find some efficiency, but bureaucracies aren't designed necessarily to be completely efficient, as they are supposed to be good stewards of taxpayer money. And that drives some inefficiency to make sure they're doing that. So definitely move in that direction would be appropriate. One of the things out of Tom's pitch, NASA's budget's on the order of $25 billion a year, and DOD's is around $800 billion a year. And so I think if you ask people who didn't know those numbers, they'd estimate that NASA's is close to DOD's. It's amazing what NASA's getting done with the money they have. And NASA's job is not only to lead this nation, but lead the world in space exploration with some of the items I talked about, with the science, the exploration, national posture and inspiration. That's part of their charter. And NASA's job is to do the hard things. NASA, for this overall Moon to Mars initiative, is the system architect and the system integrator. And those are critical for system success. I'm optimistic that this nation will recognize the value that NASA provides for a relatively low dollar value.
Well, I think that's a good way to end things off. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. I see that we've gone just a few minutes over, but I do want to thank everyone for their participation today. Thanks to our panelists for their insight and their knowledge, and a special thank you to our participants on the call, and have a great weekend, everyone.
That wraps up their presentation, but we'll sign off by saying normally we would stop after every segment and make statements or ask questions. Instead, we're going to ask you to make comments about the presentation and where you noticed that their concerns directly align with previous episodes from this channel. Also, formulate questions for us to ask the panel during the second presentation that will be coming up on a future date, TBD. And we're attempting to arrange direct interviews with one or more of the panelists so we can go through a specific topic in detail. Thanks for watching this episode of the Common Sense Skeptic. As this is information every space fan should enjoy, please share this along your social media networks. If you would like to support future CSS productions directly, you can find us on Buy Me a Coffee, GoFundMe, and Patreon. Links in the video description. Also, please make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, give the episode a thumbs up, and ring that notification bell so that you'll know when the Common Sense Skeptic returns.